Welcome to Liberal Values Beyond Our Shores with Greg Sheridan and Dave Sharma, and thank you very much for joining us here this evening. We are a full flight this evening, so please move all the way to the end of the aisle or the row. We're going to need those seats as people continue to trickle in. Those of you who've been to these events that I've hosted before know that it's not your traditional Liberal Party event. There's no raffle. Much to your disappointment, I'm sure. There's no auction, and it's not about the red team versus the blue team. This event is about the big ideas and the big events that are shaping our lives. Previous events we've had with Andrew Hastie and Andrew Bolt, Jacinta Price and Rita Panahi, and Amanda Stoker and Miranda Devine. And I've deliberately selected from among my colleagues some of the most promising up-and-coming new backbenchers to showcase to you the incredible intellectual depth and talent that we have in the Liberal Party, and I've paired them with some of our most respected and authoritative commentators. Tonight I hope it will be no different, and the theme of this evening, given the expertise of our guests, is going to be on foreign affairs. I'd like to recognise some special guests who are here this evening. From the State Parliament, Bev MacArthur MP, former Senator Judith Troth, former Senator Jim Short, the former member for Wannon, David Hawker, and the former Victorian MP, Mark Birrell. From the Admin Committee, we have Vice President Holly Byrne and Russell Joseph, the Young Liberal President Nicholas Lamana, a former Vice President Norma Wells, and a former Women's Section Chair Carol Walters. To introduce the two guests this evening and to explain the format of the evening, we will be having a panel discussion here on the stage, and I'll be interviewing them, Tony Jones style. If they advocate violence, I will be very strict with them, unlike Fran Kelly was on Monday. And then we'll throw the opportunity over to you to ask some questions. Please do keep them brief, because the only complaint I've ever had after these events is that not everyone who wanted to ask a question was able to. So the briefer that you keep it, the better chance that someone else will have to answer a question, to ask a question. Firstly, I want to introduce my friend and colleague Dave Sharma. I first met Dave, as a lot of people have in our world, when he was our ambassador to Israel. You might have heard his bio, which includes that he was appointed the youngest ever ambassador at age 37. He was surprisingly appointed by Julie Gillard and Bob Carr. But what distinguished Dave from all the other people that I met in the diplomatic corps in my time in Parliament was that he was a really entrepreneurial diplomat who had really creative ways of progressing Australia's values in the Middle East, but also that he was a values-driven diplomat. He understood that part of his role was not just standing up for our interests, but also standing up for our values, and that particularly in the case of Israel, those two things are intimately connected. I don't know how he survived DFAT, but maybe we'll get onto that. When Dave came back to Australia, and I know was expressing an interest in running for Parliament, I was one of the first people to encourage him to do so. I was delighted to hear that someone of his calibre wanted to represent our party in the Parliament. When Dave and I first caught up, one of the pieces of advice I gave him, which is a fairly generic but truthful piece of advice, is you never know when your opportunities will arise in politics. That was quite true in Dave's case. Neither of us could have foreseen that it was not a few months later that there was a by-election in Wentworth which he was endorsed by the Liberal Party for, stood for, did not win, but persevered and came back at the general election. And it's one of the things that's distinguished him from the rest of the class of 2019. He's someone of courage, of intellect and moral clarity, and I think he'll be a huge addition to our party and our Parliament in this term and beyond. Greg Sheridan, you all know, as Australia's most respected commentator on foreign affairs for decades. He's someone who is always worth reading, he is always worth listening to, and his advice is always worth following, even if it gets you into trouble, which it did for me on one occasion, which Greg will recall. It was during the debate we were having in Australia about a possible extradition treaty between Australia and China. Greg had been writing about this issue, which brought it to my attention, and it was gnawing at my conscience that the government that I was part of was proposing an extradition treaty with a country that had a 99.9% conviction rate in their criminal justice system and boasted about it. And so during that time I sought Greg's advice. I rang him and I sought his counsel. When I later had to share with the then Prime Minister that I had been consulting Greg's advice. To put it politely, it was not warmly received, this news. And I was informed if I wanted advice about these matters that I should speak to the Prime Minister or his officials. But of course the problem with that is that the advice they would have given me was that the extradition treaty was a great deal for Australia and that we should support it. That was not the advice that Greg gave me, and I'm glad I followed his advice. And history might have been a bit different had I not. So Greg, thank you very much for that advice, even if it was career limiting in my case. Let's move to the discussion phase, and an obvious point to start is China. And Greg, by coincidence, wrote an excellent article recently in The Australian, which had 15 rules for politicians about China. And all of them are worth taking heed of in our profession, but one of them was a particular favourite and I want to share it with you. It's rule number 14, and I quote, "Listen to business executives on the specifics of their industry, but don't ever let them set the tone politically for the relationship. Their political judgment is rotten, and they generally have no very deep institutional commitment to liberal democratic values, while their understanding of security beyond their own firm is extremely thin. Many businesses active in China understand their best chance of prospering is to maintain an extremely low profile and, as far as possible, not come to the attention of the Chinese authorities. Others think they do well by sucking up publicly and especially by having a shot at their own government. The Chinese are good at convincing businesses that everything would be fine except for the foolishness of Canberra." Former Trade Minister Andrew Robb was pathetic in describing a failed deal of his own in these terms. That sums up my worldview on lots of things actually about business and taking advice from business on politics. But Greg, it was a very salutary warning in Australia's relationship with China, because when myself or Dave or Andrew Hastie or anyone else has something to say on this topic, it's usually not more than 24 hours later that we get slapped down by business figures and business leaders. But why is it that our business community, in this particular context, has become so craven?
Well, James, just before I answer your question, just one or two very brief general comments. First of all, I want to thank the good Senator for inviting me here today. You know, it makes me think the old Catholic doctrine of purgatory has had a resurrection, you know, where you get time off in purgatory for suffering on earth, you know, and I'm going to get you a bit of time off as a result of tonight. What a joy it is to be here with two men I greatly admire, David Sharma and James Patterson. Although, do you think there's a subtext here? These two sleek, ambitious, debonair, worldly, ruthless young politicians inviting someone to share the stage with them who's a bit more crumpled and older, reminds you what politicians used to look like in the 1980s. I wonder if there was a subtext there. Anyway, and the final throat-clearing point is to say to you that 14 months ago I published a book called God is Good For You, A Defence of Christianity in Troubled Times. It is a tribute to my regard for James that this is the first event I've done since that moment, which I haven't had a pile of books for sale, and hasn't been, you know, whatever the alleged topic is, the role of dance in opera or anything, I could generally take it round to the book, which I urge you all to buy because it's still available. Gimmicks and good bookstores. And
Christmas is just around the corner.
Very good Christmas present, especially if you have recalcitrant children. Now, James, to answer your question, I do think a lot of people say the Australian system doesn't work because we don't reconcile our security advice and our commercial advice about China. Anyone in a security agency is perennially very worried about China. And anyone in a commercial agency is generally saying, look at all the money. As Tony Abbott famously said to Angela Merkel, what drives you on China? He said two impulses, fear and greed. And both of those are perfectly sensible impulses. I'm not all that critical of business because very often I wish business would just do business. I don't actually want them to tell us about gay marriage or, you know, human rights for left-handed whales or whatever their latest woke stuff is. So I don't mind them coming to government and saying, this is marginally impacting my ability to ship the 4 millionth tonne of coal or whatever. Although actually there's no evidence that anything we've done has had any effect on our trade in China. we could not really be doing any more trade with China than we are doing. And indeed, I think one of our national vulnerabilities is that we're too dependent on China. We should try to diversify our trade. This is where I think the Adani mine matter was so important. You're not going to get the Indians into our resources trade unless you do something like Adani. I think it was tragic that the New South Wales government prevented a South Korean-owned coal mine from going ahead in New South Wales. We want India and South Korea. We want to diversify our trade. But so my criticism is often not so much at business, although they do say some astonishingly stupid things. I mean, I was at a forum with Kerry Stokes a year or two ago, and Colin Barnett and a few others, and they were all saying, and James Packer, whom I have a great deal of respect, James was saying we should be more grateful to the Chinese for what great customers they were. Kerry Stokes said it made him sick to see American troops in Australia, and Colin Barnett said every other country was managing its relationship with China well. Well, okay, what happened? Jamie Packer, about a minute later, all of his staff got arrested and thrown into the clink in China, and he lost his business. Kerry Stokes must have been sick for a very long time, because there have been American troops in Australia one way or another since about 1942, and we were pretty happy about it at the time. And then, as for Colin Barnett, the idea that we alone have had troubles with China is of course barking mad. Every nation in our region, and most nations in the world, have from time to time been put in the doghouse by China. The Chinese Communist Party has, as part of its ideological repertoire, ideological conflict with wicked foreigners, and that's part of the nationalism which it uses to legitimise itself. I don't mind business coming to government and saying, we're paying a little price for your policies, but I always want government to be brave enough to say, we've heard you, we'll help you if we can do it in a way that is not inconsistent with our national security and our core values. What I am a bit disappointed about with business is that their adherence to liberal values or to universal human rights is more or less non-existent. They'll spend millions of dollars lecturing Australians about what we should do on some marginal matter of social policy and enforcing dreadful conformity on their own employees. But the Chinese state puts 1 million Uyghurs in re-education camps, smashes every Christian church, puts pastors in jail, imprisons all the human rights lawyers. I mean, Alan Joyce had very little to say about this. You know, I don't necessarily want him to go out and get into a fight over it, but, and then, you know, you've seen it with international business too. The NBA, one guy puts out one tweet saying something nice about the Hong Kong demonstrators, and then the NBA treats him as though he's committed the sin against the Holy Spirit. So, I don't mind business just sticking to business, but I don't think we should let them make our political decisions.
Your mention of the NBA saga is a good segue to my question to Dave, because there seems to be in public debate, definitely in Australia, and I didn't think in America, but now we know also in America, a real hypersensitivity about discussing China and discussing the good and the bad things about our relationship with China. Dave, one of the things you did not long after you were elected, which I thought showed great courage, is you came to the aid of Andrew Hastie when he was under fire for his observations about the China relationship. And Dave took to Twitter, I think it was a 10 or 11 long thread tweet, that's always promising, 10 or 11 tweets long, and this is what he said: Hastie is right to ring the bell on this issue and to warn that our greatest vulnerability lies in our thinking, which is Panglossian at times. In World War II, we failed to realise early enough that German ambitions could not be accommodated. National Socialist Germany was not a status quo power, but we mistook it as such or deceived ourselves that it was. Why, Dave, was there such a strong reaction to Andrew Hastie's observations, and why did you feel the need that you had to jump in with your credibility and experience and make those observations?
Look, I think, firstly, thank you so much for having me here tonight, James and Greg, for joining me on the stage, and thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. Look, I think there are two great myths that we, I think, continue to labour under with the China relationship in Australia. One is that it should be a straightforward relationship. If it ever was, it is no longer, and that's not because we've changed; it's because China has changed. And the other great myth is that if something goes wrong in the relationship, it must be our fault. And this is still the, I think, reflexive impulse of a lot of people in this relationship. And the Chinese are very good at exploiting, you know, this tendency amongst Australians that it must be our fault that we've done something to grievously offend them, that other countries have managed to get along with them fine. And we used to have a great relationship. What's happened lately? I think so. Andrew. What attracted all this anger was that Andrew made a comparison to National Socialist Germany, and I think he chose his words quite carefully. He didn't say like the Chinese regime was like the Nazi regime. He was making a point of comparison about Germany's rise and the failure of the international system to accommodate that, and how that led to conflict. That was my view of it. And he was sort of shouted down, I thought in rather unfair terms, by picking up on a few things he didn't say. He didn't say that China's about to preside over the Holocaust. He didn't say that China's, although they are, that he didn't say China's persecuting a particular minority amongst them. And I thought it showed an unwillingness to have a debate, an open debate about these issues in Australia. And one of the things I feel most strongly about is that the public deserves, and we as politicians have a duty to provide an open and honest debate about the challenges of this relationship. Because there will come a time, and there already have come times, when we will have to pay some sort of price, an economic price, a trade deal foregone, a business that's upset about something. And unless we've articulated to the public why we are doing this, what the interests are at stake, what we're seeking to preserve, and why we're asking the public to make these trade-offs, then we won't have the support we need to. So by pretending that everything is always good in the relationship, and that's why I use that phrase Panglossian in that Twitter thread, by pretending that everything is always good in the relationship, that everything is rosy and optimistic, if we could just get beyond these sorts of things, we're not only doing a disservice to the relationship and our interest, but we're doing a disservice to the public awareness of these issues, which will ultimately need to have a better understanding of these issues if we're to take difficult decisions, which we may have to take in years ahead.
Considering the issues of human rights abuses in China, whether it's the Uyghurs, as Greg says, the persecuted church, whether it's Tibet, Hong Kong, the Australian citizen who's currently detained, Dr. Yang Kengjun, who's a writer and has been detained on espionage charges, is the free world, this is a question to both of you, is the free world doing enough to stand up against this? Have we been unified and strong enough in our criticism? Are there other things that we should be doing to address these?
Well, James, the short answer is no. The free world really generally comes down to one thing. Evelyn Waugh said of Irishmen, and I must say I'm of Irish background myself, for the Irishman there are only two final realities: hell and the United States of America. And the free world really always comes down to the United States of America. And one reason the US is having a bit of a crisis of identity about leading the free world is that we've all been such free riders, such freeloaders on American military and financial and moral capital. So Australia is one of the first, quite an early nation in getting out of co-sponsoring the annual United States resolution at the United Nations on Chinese human rights. And I have to shamefully tell you that I think I supported our doing that at the time, because I was a young, foolish, innocent journalist at that time, and I tended to believe what governments told me. And we set up this preposterous thing called the Australia-China Human Rights Dialogue, which was the only purpose of which was to give us an alibi for not saying anything at all publicly ever about human rights in China. And then 4 or 5 years ago, the Chinese decided they would dispense even with that fiction, so they just abolished that dialogue. It doesn't exist now. Now, I think the Morrison government has got it pretty much right. I think they have made solid statements. Now, you might say, well, what's the point of making a statement if it's not going to have any effect? I think there are several reasons you should. The first is, you don't know that it's not going to have any effect. If a lot of countries got together, especially countries which value human rights, and had something to say about it, isn't it shameful that the Muslim world is completely indifferent to the suffering of the Uyghurs because they've got their financial interests with China and so forth.
Just on that, Greg, not only different, when there was a motion to condemn China on the Uyghur matter recently at the UN, there was a counter statement put out, co-signed by a number of majority Muslim countries, that not only said was not just silent on the issue, but actually defensive about China on the issue, and said, "Oh, well, you know, it's an internal matter for China." That's amazingly craven support for persecution of people you should be naturally sympathetic for.
Absolutely, and it makes you wonder how seriously you ought to take their protestations about Israel or whatever too. How much of a double standard. But I'm terribly long-winded. I mustn't go on here, but I do think that saying things may not have an effect, but it may have some effect. And if you don't say anything, you certainly won't have any effect. You know, you won't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. The other thing is, there is a question of our own self-respect here. If you know, we are pretty rich, we're pretty safe overall, although I wish we were a lot safer. If even we won't say a word about our fellow human beings savagely persecuted, this is not people just not doing real well economically, but savagely persecuted. And then the final reason is that the persecuted people would want us to speak up for them. And, you know, every testimony we have from prisoners of conscience, political prisoners, religious prisoners, throughout all history, is that when they hear that someone has remembered them and cared about them from outside, it means a great deal to them.
Dave, do you have anyone else to add?
I think I by and large agree with Greg. I mean, I'm a realist and a pragmatist when it comes to these issues, but I don't believe our conduct of our foreign relationship should ever become disanchored from our values. And I think this is an important question of values. You know, do I labour under the illusion that a statement by itself from us will change things? No, but I think it's important to the character of who we are. And I think it's also important to remember that, you know, when the whole of the world gets up and speaks about this, and you know, I think we had 21 ambassadors, including our own, write a letter to Chinese authorities asking about the fate of the Uyghurs, asking to visit the province where they are. It does undermine China's legitimacy, or the legitimacy of the Communist Party rule of China, and that's, you know, not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you recall, you know, a large part of what undid the Soviet Union was not only its fundamental economic weaknesses, but the fact that its claims about being a legitimate spokesperson for its people, you know, after its people, were undermined by dissidents and people who spoke out, and the Jews who fled, and the fact that they had to, you know, imprison people in the Soviet Union and grant them exit visas, and it ultimately eroded their legitimacy and their ability to project their values abroad. And I think this is why we should also not hesitate to call out things like this.
There was a couple of good segues to other topics, but if in the Q&A later you want to return to these issues, please feel free. Greg mentioned the identity crisis that the United States is going through, and I visited the US recently as a guest of the State Department looking at foreign and defence policy, and the consistent message that we got was, yes, the President appears erratic, and yes, his tweets are all over the place, and he might not seem to value America's traditional alliances like previous presidents have, but don't worry, everyone around him is the conventional people you'd expect to be advising a Republican president, and the consensus within Congress is very strong about America's traditional alliances and supporting them. And then at the end of our trip, Donald Trump announced the withdrawal of American troops from northern Syria, abandoning the Kurds, who he and previous US presidents have promised to stand by. What should we read out of that episode in northern Syria?
Well, that's a huge question, and you will marvel at the pithiness and brevity of my answer. Look, I have to confess, and this may not be all that popular, I was a never Trump conservative. I thought Trump was just unfit to be president on any standard, and I still think that on the whole, but you know, voters were presented with a binary choice, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. And I followed the debate in a lot of American Christian journals, and they were very sensible and shrewd about it. They said, look, Donald Trump is not one of us. Anybody who thinks that Donald Trump is going to lead a revival of Christian America, you know, really needs to have the Bex and a good lie down. But But he will appoint Supreme Court judges who won't abridge our religious freedom. He will bolster the military. He will cut taxes. He will deregulate. And he has done all those things. And as a result, America now has an unemployment rate of 3.6%, 5.4% amongst blacks, a historic low. We have a bigger US defence budget than we would have under any other president. So I think Trump has actually, on balance, been more good than bad. I also think the disruption that Trump has caused has been a bit less than meets the eye. He has a pattern now, and this is going to be a bit of a problem for him. He threatens absolute Armageddon, fire and fury, the like of which the world has never seen. And then he ends up, you know, falling in love with Kim Jong-un, the least lovable person. If there are 7 billion people on the planet, he would be in a short list of 3 to be the least lovable, you know, grotesque, sadistic, weird Stalinist dictator with a hairdo. Goodness me. But mind you, I've noticed that people with big hair often like other people with big hair. And, but I do think in the end, the United States is a reliable ally. However, I do think we should be doing much more to look after ourselves. We should have a much more powerful and robust defence force in case one day we're called upon to look after ourselves by ourselves. But one thing I do think Trump has hurt in the world is that lack of moral clarity which the US president used to have. I mean, the president was basically the secular pope of the world, and you know, if the president, and this debauching of the presidency has been going on a long time now. I think Bill Clinton has a great deal to answer for. He lied under oath to the grand jury and then survived an impeachment process. So everybody has learned from that. You can be hyper-partisan and you can survive anything. I think Trump will survive this impeachment process. But, you know, people respond to moral leadership. The prestige of the West is in decline now. There's no doubt this is having a big effect in Asia. The prestige of democracy is not what it was. So I wish we could get the good things out of Trump and not get the bad things from him, but I guess human nature always gives you the good and the bad together, except for James Patterson and David.
Dave, one of the points that I saw you make in commenting on the situation in Syria is that in some ways Trump is continuing the Obama policy on Syria. Are we reaping what Obama sowed in Syria, and what are the implications for the region of that?
Yeah, look, I think that's right. So I think I didn't agree with, you know, the announcement to withdraw those troops from northeastern Syria, basically because I think it was buying security and influence on the cheap. There were, you know, a couple hundred US servicemen who were not in harm's way, who, by their de facto presence, controlled a quarter of the country through the Kurdish, the YPG, the Kurdish militia, and gave the US a seat at the table, and that is all gone now. But the parameters of this policy were set by President Obama and the Obama administration. I mean, it was, I mean, it's strange because a lot of Trump's instinctive reaction is to do what Obama didn't do or repudiate what Obama did. But on this, it's been a study in continuity. I mean, Obama was criticised rightly for sort of selling out his allies, not standing by Mubarak during the Egyptian Spring, supporting the street against him and leading to the toppling, which had a chilling effect on allies. Trump has done the same thing with the Kurds and not stood by them, which has had a chilling effect on allies. Obama failed to enforce his red lines, which meant his credibility was hurt when he, you know, threatened reprisals if Syria used chemical weapons. The Assad regime used chemical weapons. The Obama administration did not respond, and Trump has really done the same thing with Iranian and Turkish behaviour. He told the Iranians if they messed around, they'd pay a price. Well, they've shot down the US drone, there was no response. They've taken up half of Saudi oil production for a very complicated and sophisticated military operation, and there has been no response. You know, he threatened fire and brimstone on the Turks if they, you know, went into northern Syria too aggressively. Well, the Turks have gone in and secured exactly what they needed to secure and wanted to secure, and I think that has undermined his credibility. So, you know, I don't think he certainly hasn't improved upon US policy in the Middle East, but it's actually been quite a study in continuity. And my big worry is, I mean, look, the biggest player in the Middle East these days, the leader you want to visit, the person you go and see first is Putin. If you're the Saudis, if you're the Emiratis, if you're the Egyptians, if you're the Jordanians, if you're the Israelis, that's the leader who you want to have on speed dial. Yeah, Trump is probably second, but that is an amazing inversal of fortunes. The US has been the unparalleled leader in the Middle East since the end of the Cold War, the country with the biggest influence, and that has been allowed to flip itself around because of decisions of US administrations now over the past 12 years.
And ultimately, what does all this mean for our friends, Israel, in this new environment, and who is going to be leading Israel in these circumstances?
What did you go first?
Well, look, I think, Israel has always had a doctrine of they need to be able to, defend themselves by themselves. I think that's only more true today. I think there are, growing risks, and I think Greg actually touched upon this in his column on Saturday, if I'm correct, or the weekend before. There are actually growing risks of a conflict between Israel and Iran, and the US has largely been a stabilising presence there. The idea that the Israelis relied upon the Americans to kind of take care of the worst of Iranian aggression, and the Iranians were deterred by the fact that anything too adventurous on their part would be met with an American response. Now, what Trump has done in both the withdrawal of the troops from northeastern Syria and the failure to respond to the attack on Saudi oil infrastructure has basically sort of withdrawn that buffer, which means I think Iran will be inclined to be more aggressive in pursuing its aims in the region, thinking there's a less likelihood of a US response, and Israel will need to think it needs to assume more of the burden of tackling the most problematic elements of Iranian nuclear behaviour. You would have seen today, Iran has announced they've installed new centrifuge capacity. They're holding stockpiles of enriched uranium higher than the Iranian nuclear agreement allows. They're installing centrifuge capacity more than it allows. So I think it's a dangerous time. Israel will survive, it's strong enough, and Iran is not an existential threat to Israel. Israel doesn't really face existential threats in the region anymore, but it does mean it's going to be quite a turbulent period ahead. And for countries that aren't able to defend themselves by themselves, and this includes the Saudis, and the Emiratis, the UAE, it poses some difficult decisions for them. The idea that they will probably need to accommodate the reality of the Iranian power in the region.
I'll just add to that. So I feel that almost uniquely I can behave like a Supreme Court judge here and say I concur with my learned colleague. But the only thing I'd add is that so I endorse Dave's analysis completely.
As long as yours, I think, Greg.
Well, success over 1,000 farmers. My wife JC, who's in the hall here, and I were on the Golan Heights 18 months or a bit more ago, and right on the border with Syria, and you couldn't go 30 seconds without hearing shell fire and explosions and so on. The level of violence on Israel's borders everywhere, and you can't really stand too prominently out and about in the southern town of Sderot in Israel, because someone in the Gaza Strip will take a pot shot at you, especially if you happen to be with an Israeli military figure. So the level of violence all over Israel's borders. Now, it's a long-held view of mine that weakness is provocative. Trump's general instinct to pull back a bit from the Middle East is not entirely a bad instinct. So we can look back now. I supported Bush in the Iraq War, but we can look back and say the aftermath of the Iraq War was very badly handled. In any event, no American president is going to commit to a big ground war in the Middle East or Afghanistan again, as long as you can imagine. But as Dave said, the troops in Syria were buying security and influence and a place at the table very, very cheaply. Russia's whole economy is only the size of Australia's economy. With 40 aircraft, it's achieving strategic effects that the United States couldn't achieve with the most vast, big and expansive air force in the world. So when you react against having ground troops in large numbers in Iraq, that doesn't mean you have to take every single American out of the region. And if by doing that, and then I was very worried about the failure to make Iran pay a price, that it was bad enough that Iran could shoot down a US military drone and nothing happened to it. It was much worse that it could, and in fact Trump handled that almost exactly as Obama did, and with an equally disastrous result. He allowed the Pentagon to proceed with a military response and then get right up to pressing the button and then abort it publicly, which is a tremendous broadcast of weakness and indecision. And then for the Iranians to attack the Saudi oil fields, the Saudi oil refining capacity, and again, not pay a price. You could easily do a very measured, precise response, do exactly to the Iranians what they did to the Saudis, but to do absolutely nothing. That's why I say Trump's whole sort of bad guy credibility. One thing I used to like about Trump very much was that he scared the bejesus out of everybody. Scared his friends as much as his enemies, but at least he also scared his enemies. You won't scare people if you constantly threaten and never follow through. And then if the Iranians are emboldened, they could miscalculate with the Israelis. And what would an Israel-Iran war look like? Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles pointed at Israel. It's not going to be the antiseptic conflict of conflicts past. Israeli civilians will die in large numbers, or at least in substantial numbers if there's a conflict. And also huge numbers of Lebanese civilians will die because the Hezbollah rockets are all in civilian populated areas. And then how much of this can Israel be expected to endure before it strikes back at Iran itself? And what happens then? And even Donald Trump can't stand outside a war like that. Now, this, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if weakness led to that outcome, you wouldn't say that was very smart.
That's a very sobering note to finish that topic on. I've got one more that I'm going to canvass with you, and then we'll throw to the audience. Hopefully this will be more upbeat, although I don't know. Greg, you've just got back from a secondment in the UK. You're at King's College in London. So you're observing Brexit and the UK parliamentary shenanigans up close. I haven't asked you either to make any predictions yet this evening, but I will now. Can Boris secure a majority, and will he be able to deliver Brexit?
Well, he can, but I went on the front page on the day of Trump's election. I had two pieces for the paper. I said to my deputy editor, I said, look, I can either do a piece on Trump's first 100 days or a piece on why Trump won't win. And the deputy editor said, well, he's not going to win, so a piece on his first 100 days is no use, so do the piece on why he can't win. So I went on the front page and said, well, Trump hasn't got a chance, has he? And he lost the popular vote by 3 million. And then still won every damn Midwest state by 3.5 votes and produced a miracle, statistically impossible victory. So that's a long-winded way of saying I'm certainly not going to make the forecast. The other thing is, at the last British election, Theresa May started the campaign 23 points ahead of Jeremy Corbyn, and she ended up in minority government. I think King's College, by the way, was astonished. They were very nice to me, I must say, but they were completely astonished at what misfortune had led them to be hosting a Conservative rebellion. They couldn't work it out. The age of Brexit produced wonders for them, But I think Brexit was a magnificent assertion of national sovereignty by the British. Absolutely magnificent. The EU is illiberal, it's undemocratic, it's very woke, it's very left-liberal, it's very bossy and interfering. It has a terrible economic model, which is, there's no European Google, there's no European Amazon, there's no European Facebook, because it's all about a corporatist keeping the old state corporations going. There's nothing new or vibrant in the European economy. The Brits are better than this, and they broke free. But the British establishment has done everything in its power to thwart the referendum result. Johnson is a big beast. May, I think, was the worst Prime Minister Britain has ever had. And Jeremy Corbyn is certainly the worst leader of the Labor Party anyone has ever seen anywhere in the world. Who could imagine that in modern day Britain you would have, as an alternative Prime Minister, one gasp away from office, a lifelong pro-terrorist, Hamas, IRA at its worst, admiring, friend of anti-Semitism, participant in anti-Semitism, sectarian leftist, Marxist, surrounded by communists who have only 5 minutes ago left the Communist Party in many cases. This is like a terrible Monty Python film. And yet, to watch the BBC in London, look, here's something that no one will agree with unless they've lived in London. The BBC makes the ABC look fair and balanced. And, to watch the BBC in London, they treat Boris Johnson as though he were one step away from being a combination of Adolf Hitler and a crazed, deranged lunatic. And they treat Jeremy Corbyn as though he's a friendly family relative. And, but Johnson is a big beast. He has reversed the fortunes of everything so far. I think his deal is actually pretty lame, and you're still going to end up with a no-deal crisis in 6 or 12 months. But it's the best thing that's on offer at the moment. Never let the perfect be the enemy of the not terrible. And his deal is not as terrible as anything else which is on offer. And he at the moment is a long way ahead in the polls, but that's a very dangerous position to be. He hasn't lost an election in 20 years, and he's a very dynamic. I've had the pleasure of interviewing him quite a lot, and he and Jacob Rees-Mogg are certainly the wittiest, with no disrespect to Dave and James, the wittiest politicians I've ever met. I mean, I'd have a lazy dollar on Bojo for sure, but and also I think it's the most consequential election. I mean, you could say Trump maybe was more consequential, but other than that, it's the most consequential election the Western world has seen for a very long time, because a Corbyn government would do more to damage the Western alliance than anything you can possibly imagine. A Johnson government with a good majority has got a good chance of pulling Brexit off and of reviving Britain. I mean, there is in Johnson that high-energy political leader. He's a bit shambolic and so forth, but he is a high-energy political leader, and he would, I think, take Britain in a good direction.
Dave, you chair the Treaties Committee of the Parliament. Are you looking forward to chairing the inquiry into a UK free trade agreement sometime soon?
I hope so. I mean, I hope this election on the 12th of December gives us a clear outcome. My worry is that it won't, and it will sort of prolong the gridlock. That the Conservatives will end up being the largest party, but not in the majority by themselves. They might have to do a deal with the Scottish Nationalists or someone like that. What will be the price of that? Will that mean dissolution of the Union? So I'd like to see that this issue get resolved. I'd like to see. I don't think the Brexit deal is a great one, but to Greg's point, I think it's better than anything else, any of the alternatives that are on offer. And the sort of prolongation of this, 2 years of political paralysis, which has characterised the British political system, cannot and must not be allowed to continue. I think Corbyn is a terrifying prospect, not only for Britain's prospects, but for Britain's place in the world, for the Jewish people of Britain, but for any number of other things. It would take the UK in a vastly different direction to I think any that it's ever been taken in recent memory. So I hope Boris gets a clear mandate for his Brexit plan and then improves it over time. But I worry a little that UK politics are so volatile at the moment. All the traditional alignments are fractured and are being rewritten, and it's hard to see quite how that will crystallise on the 12th of December.
They have a fixed terms Parliament Act, which is supposed to limit the Parliament to 5 years, and they're about to have their third election in 4 years, which says something about how successful that's been. Okay, we'll now throw it open to your questions. Please keep them on the theme of the evening, and please keep them questions. Someone from my office will come around with a microphone. Chris, can you start down here with Will, please?
Gentlemen, I'm in the finance markets, and there's an international group thing that's going on about the level of debt in the world, whether it's Israel, US, Europe, Australia, Japan, we're all totally in debt, about the same level to GDP as everybody else, but the price of money has never been cheaper. This is going to become a problem, sending a moral signal, but it's not talked about. But it's hard to get an angle on it. But given all three foreign affairs issues and how Israel dealt with higher debt levels 20 years ago, got under control. What's the thinking, James? What's in terms of Australian political system?
Thank you. Well, I'll have a stab at it and then invite others to have a go. I mean, there are two separate but closely related questions, which is the sovereign debt challenge that the world faces and the private debt challenge that the world faces. Australia's sovereign debt, relatively speaking, is higher than I'd like it to be. but by world standards is manageable. But our personal debt levels I'm more concerned about for all the reasons that you say. We've accrued incredible levels of personal debt to go very deep in the housing market at a time when interest rates are as low as they hopefully will ever be. And there is a reckoning to come, I fear, for asset prices broadly, share market and property market, when they return to more normal levels, as I assume they'll have to at some point. The destabilising effect that the relationship that China and the United States have got themselves into, where one party supplies the cheap debt and the other party can't say no to it, I think is having profound implications in the trade relationship that they have, and therefore the trade conflict that they have, and the resolution of which will potentially be not in our interests. So that's a rosy picture for you, Will.
I mean, I don't know the answer. I think we're in this unusual sort of economic period that, you know, in hindsight we will understand, but living through it is quite unusual. I mean, it's the inverse of the stagflation of the 70s, you know, which had characterised by high unemployment, high inflation. We've got low unemployment, very low inflation, you know, productivity growth lagging, high levels of debt, cheap money. I mean, a whole lot of these sort of natural correlations seem to have broken down. And our system monetary policy is not having the same stimulatory effects on the economy as it did. You know, consumer behaviour is kind of a little mysterious. Investor behaviour is mysterious. So I don't know, you know, and it's not, to state the obvious, it's not just Australia grappling with this, it's basically the entirety of the Western world. So there's something systemic that's going on there. I don't know if it's to do with our more integrated economies, more integrated supply chains, you know, the fact that that's keeping downward pressure on the prices, the fact that wages are not the same contributor to prices as they were. But it's a little, it's a bit of a conundrum, and I think we're still trying to work out the answer.
So I just add that, look, sound money is the basis of a modern civilisation, and in the end, if people lose faith in the soundness of their sovereign currency, that brings you all kinds of woe. It's true, I agree with everything James and Dave said, but I just add the observation that a number of countries which got into terrible trouble, like Spain, had relatively healthy levels of sovereign debt just before they got into terrible trouble. And of course we're particularly exposed because we have a floating currency. I mean, it's good that we have a floating currency. Nonetheless, you can be subjected to very sharp debt shocks if your currency suddenly goes through the floor. The final point I make is I urge Dave and James not to abandon the surplus. One of the problems all over the West is that Western societies which have lost their purpose because they've lost belief. And if you want to understand that process, I could recommend a very good book to you called God is Good for You. And they can no longer live within their means. So they are promising themselves social spending, which they simply cannot afford. And they're making future liabilities in pensions and health care and so on, which they simply cannot afford. And most centre-right parties around the world have completely abandoned fiscal responsibility. I mean, I hope Bojo wins. I profoundly pray that Bojo wins. The only person who is going to spend more than Bojo if they get into government will be Jeremy Corbyn. And Trump, too, has done nothing really to confront America's deficit problem. Our centre-right government is delivering a surplus. So we've got our problems too. But that's a good thing. And I don't think we should abandon the surplus. It's taken us so long to get to it. And I don't think we're in the kind of emergency situation where we should abandon our surplus.
Angela in front of you.
Okay. Thank you. Angela Wallace-Mitchell. Look, I've got a couple of questions for you, gentlemen. Regarding the Middle East, why is America so always looking favourably on Turkey? I think that, in my opinion, Turkey is a very dangerous country and their leader is a very dangerous man. That's one question. And two, where were the Europeans in the Middle East? They've been very, very silent. Nothing from the Europeans. I'm of a European background and I have very, very low regard for the Europeans. Very low regard. In fact, I think there are a lot of bastards. So that's my opinion. But that's one question. The other question Johnson were to win this next election in the UK, can he pass the law, change the law, that stops him going hard Brexit? Would he have the courage to do it and go a hard Brexit and get rid of the yoke that the European Union has put on the British people and restore their habeas corpus and their legal rights as well? Thank you.
Greg and Dave, take a stab at any and all you feel that you can in those questions, but quickly so we can continue to move on to others.
Sure. Well, look, let me say, Europeans are God's children too, but I must say I like European people, but I hate European governments, and I particularly detest the EU, which is purely the work of the devil. But to answer your two questions, the civilisational failure we're living through at the moment has at its most acute the failure of Europe. And Europe's failure is multidimensional, and nowhere is this more important than in security. The Europeans decided to bomb Colonel Gaddafi out of power in Libya, and they ran out of ammunition. They ran out of bombs. The Americans had to give them the bombs. I mean, here is Vladimir Putin with an economy our size, a bit smaller than Italy's, a broken-backed, busted country, nothing much works there except the military, and he can change the strategic alignments everywhere. And Europe, with all its pompous grandstanding and all Macron's idiotic talk about a, European independent force and, separating itself from NATO and all the rest of it, can do nothing. Can do nothing. It couldn't even solve the Balkans crisis. Back in the old days when the American power was stronger than it is now, I remember Ashton Calvert, the late Ashton Calvert, saying to me, all that it took to solve the Balkans crisis was the whisper of American power. Just the whisper of American power. And everybody suddenly said, oops, no, only joking, only joking. No, we don't want to tangle with you. Sorry about that. Oh, did you misunderstood? You misunderstood our firing on all those innocents. Just a clerical error. Now, Bojo, I think, will have to confront the hard Brexit again. I'll tell you why, very simply, very quickly. The agreement he's got commits him to following all the EU rules until the end of the transition period. And that in the period of the transition period, he's supposed to negotiate a free trade agreement with the European Union. That's 1 year away. The European Union, in its history, has never been known to blow its nose within the space of 1 year. The idea that it could negotiate a free trade agreement, which under European law has to be passed by all 27 national parliaments, plus regional parliaments, the Walloons have to pass it, and of course the price they will demand for giving Britain a free trade agreement will be that acute regulatory alignment. Probably the Brits will have to continue to be subject to the rules of the European Court of Justice on trade matters, and on and on and on and on. And so in 6 or 12 months we'll be exactly where we were a few months ago. The difference is, if Bojo has a majority of 50, he will say, well, damn you all to hell, we're just leaving and we're going to trade on World Trade Organisation rules, which is what they should have done in the first place. If he doesn't do that, he will end up having the worst of all possible worlds, where they obey all the EU's diktats and don't even have the limited rights which they had as members. I think he'll do it, but it depends if he has the majority. You see, if he has a majority of 5, then he only needs 5 of his colleagues to be arch remainers, and he can't do it. If he has a majority of 50, he can do it.
Thank you.
Dave?
I'll just pick up the Turkey part of the question. I mean, look, Turkey traditionally has been the easternmost NATO ally in Europe, so it was always of a strategic importance to control the entrance to the Black Sea, control the Dardanelles, as we well know from the Gallipoli campaign, and so has always been useful. And look, up until 2005, 2006, 2007, Turkey was basically,
Yes.
a model of a country that was Muslim majority, but that was democratic, pluralistic, liberal in outlook, and was moving more and more towards our norms. It's taken a sharp turn in the opposite direction and continues to head in that way. I think we are toughening up our approach to Turkey, we being the West. Collectively, the US Congress, or the House of Representatives in the US, just passed a resolution recognising the Armenian genocide, which they would not have done. a few years ago. So I think that relationship is changing, but look, the difficulty is for now they're an indispensable part of NATO and our force projection and missile defence, air defences against Russia for all of Europe. So we still need them to a high degree, but I think that attitude is changing.
Lady in the middle there, I think, had a question. Yep, please come around.
This is a question for Greg. Greg, interested in your thoughts on Indonesia, and to give you due credit, you're one of the few commentators I've ever come across who regularly and comprehensively covers it.
Well, thank you very much. What a nice thing for you to say. So look, Indonesia is always in that category of better than we feared, not as good as we hoped. And Jokowi is a very unusual president. He really has no interest in international affairs. I interviewed him when he was governor of Jakarta. Obviously a nice guy, moderate himself. I think Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono had a great interest in international affairs. Jokowi's instinct is to be an economic moderniser and reformer, but he has to manage a very difficult domestic political system. Indonesia can never undertake the kind of economic reforms it needs to, so its growth is always sluggish. It's always about 5 or 6%, which is generally just over or just below the level it needs to absorb the new entrants into the labour market. But you never get that kind of huge burst of growth which you've got in the East Asian tigers. You never get that tremendous industrialisation. You haven't had that spread of low-cost, low-tech manufacturing throughout Indonesia. You don't have the call centres that you've got in the Philippines and India and so on. The Indonesians are generally of a pretty easygoing and tolerant disposition. I've interviewed a lot of Indonesian terrorists and they always say to you, you know, would you like a cup of tea? One of them said to me, the head of Indonesian Defenders Front said to me, what we want to do is to sweep the streets of Jakarta and smash up and throw out all the foreigners. I said, oh, Pa, you mean me? And he said, no, not you, Pa, not you. And he said, here is my card. If you run into any trouble with our people on the street, just show them my card. That was a very Indonesian. I had a colleague there who was visited by his mother, who was in her late 80s, and, you know, to show her around a bit, he took her with him to work a few times, and they were covering a demonstration. And all the demonstrators were screaming blood and thunder. And then they saw this white-haired old lady and they said, Ibu, oh, please, get back everybody, make a distance. So my colleague wanted to corral his mother and keep her there forever. It's a very complex, multifaceted, very diverse country. And the final thought I'd offer you is that we need to manage it well, obviously, but as with China, it's not always the case that we're at fault if there's a disagreement. But nonetheless, we need to pay a lot of attention to it. No two close neighbours are more different than Indonesia and Australia. The one thing that worries me more than anything else about Indonesia is that traditional indigenous Indonesian Islam is a very syncretic, tolerant, easygoing practice of Islam, probably the most in the world, really. I had the great pleasure of knowing very well Abdurrahman Wahid, the late leader of Nahdlatul Ulama. He was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful guy, and he led a wonderful movement, tremendously easygoing, very tolerant, very realistic. I remember him telling me once that Israel was an island of democracy in a sea of dictatorships, and he revealed that Yasser Arafat had said it was his ambition to throw all the Jews into the sea, and you know, he was saying publicly that Arafat had no interest in peace and he wasn't going to get the support of Indonesia just because they were Muslims and so on. Now that temper of Islam is being slowly eroded by the globalisation of Islam. Everybody now in Indonesia watches their satellite TV, they watch CNN, they watch Al Jazeera, and the direct influence of the norms of Middle East Islam is becoming increasingly important in Indonesia. And Islam in Indonesia, liberated now after the long years of military rule anyway, is becoming increasingly conservative. I wouldn't say it's becoming increasingly extremist, and there's no broad support for jihadism within Indonesia, but it is becoming conservative and somewhat intolerant. Now, it's our role as journalists to take every trend to its most illogical and startling and frightening conclusion. But if that trend went on uninterrupted, it would be a bit of a worry.
Up the back on the aisle over there.
Thank you. Probably a question for Dave initially. Interested in your key takeaways from the ASEAN Summit. What was most important coming out of that? And then the second part of the question for the panel is 3 or 4 plausible, if not possible, scenarios in the future for the South China Sea.
Look, I think so. The East Asia Summit the Prime Minister's just been at in Thailand was probably notable for 2 main things from our perspective. One, the Prime Minister had a meeting with the Chinese Premier, which is a good thing, and I think the language that was coming out of that was constructive from both sides. And I think it's always important that we recognise that there's a mutual interest in this relationship. It's not only that we're the beneficiary and China is the provider. We actually both benefit from this relationship. And I thought the language that came out of that meeting reflected as much, and hopefully we're seeing a bit more of a sort of pragmatism from the Chinese side about the conduct of that relationship. The second very important thing was basically the finalisation of this now 15-country trade agreement called RCEP, or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which will be, it's a very big trade deal. It will cover about 29% of global GDP. It will cover large swathes of Australian exports, about 60% of our export markets. It's got lots of these modern features of trade agreements, which means it deals with services. It means it deals with regulatory and licensing issues, behind the borders barriers and things like that. So great economic opportunity for Australia in that. It will help stitch the region more closely together. The big unfortunate thing though is that India's decided to stay on the sidelines, and India's got a very sort of, its natural tendencies on these issues are quite protectionist on trade issues, and quite sort of non-aligned. That's sort of its history since the decolonisation period. But it'd been my hope with Modi as Prime Minister, re-elected with a fresh mandate, who has spoken a lot about trade and India's important role in the Asia Pacific, that he would have found a way to stare down his domestic opponents of this deal and bring India in. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened, and that is a real absence. Hopefully the door remains open and they will come in at a later date, but the fact that they're not there at the get-go means it's an unbalanced agreement. It means China's market dominates more of that trading bloc than it otherwise would have, and I think it just means that the liberalisation pressures that India would benefit from if it was in this deal will now no longer be there.
Greg, why don't you have a go at the South China Sea, and I'll see if I can usefully add anything afterwards.
Sure thing. So, come to the South China Sea, let me give you a sentence on the East Asia Summit. Now, I predicted, I'm just going to disagree with Dave here, but I want to preface it by saying I predicted Dave is going to become Prime Minister. So I have a very strong stake in my judgment that Dave Sharma is almost always right. And it's no disrespect to James, because he's in the wrong house. But I do think RCEP is a typical ASEAN spoken mirrors nonsense. It's all very well. It's good enough. I mean, I suffered the tremendous disadvantage of having covered ASEAN for 40 years, and there are things which ASEAN committed to 40 years ago, which it's just about to implement any day of the clock now. And RCEP means almost nothing to Australia. We have free trade agreements with every country which is a member of RCEP, so market access is zero. We have common membership of the Trans-Pacific Partnership with Japan, Vietnam, Singapore and Malaysia. So the services agreements are infinitely more robust, detailed, sophisticated, important with those countries under TPP than anything under RCEP. The actual agreement itself is an agreement in principle to implement all these things. Well, as I say, ASEAN makes agreements in principle, with a certain regularity. But really liberalising services involves interfering with your own companies and so on. So, who knows? Look, having said all that, the Morrison government did a good thing by being involved with it. It moves the train perhaps 1/4 of a millimetre in the right direction. Well, that's a lot better than going in the wrong direction. On the South China Sea, my guess would be that we've probably reached a certain plateau of stability in the South China Sea because China has achieved all of its strategic objectives. It has taken more sort of oceanic and island territory than is the size of the Mediterranean in Europe. And it has, it did so predominantly under Obama. Great failure of Obama to provide any serious pushback to it. We've got nothing to shout about because we wouldn't do a freedom of navigation operation. Now, mind you, of course, we're mice and we'd like to be rats. And only if the big rat comes in our area can we march with him, you know. And when Obama was being so weak on the South China Sea, that more or less ensured that we would be even weaker. And so nothing was done at a time when the Chinese quite probably would have pulled back if they'd met any significant resistance. It's now too late to dislodge them, but it's very important that we keep sailing through and flying over and so on to make it clear that we don't recognise their claims of sovereignty. Now, we do have robust and regular and frequent patrols through the South China Sea. We never go within the 12 nautical mile limit of the Chinese artificial islands. But the Chinese have claimed all the islands they wanted. They've artificially created a number of islands, you know, building up atolls into making them permanent land features. President Xi Jinping promised he would never militarise the South China Sea. It's fully militarised now. They all have Air Force bases that can take very big aeroplanes. I once raised all this with a very senior Australian politician. He said to me, "Oh, don't worry, in the event of a war, the Americans could vaporise them in a minute." But that means that short of an all-out China-US war, China now has the power to project immense military power. This is disastrous for us strategically because it removes one of our greatest assets, which is strategic depth. And if they succeed in getting a military base in the South Pacific, that will make it even more disastrous for us. We have not done much about it, but there's not, you know, we were never going to be the decisive player. The decisive player was going to be the United States. Having achieved all their strategic objectives, you know, you could certainly create very alarming scenarios. The Chinese have said they'll never prevent shipping going through it. Well, they won't either until they do. And then we'll have a lot of trouble. There are a lot of other things that they can do from the South China Sea which would be very disturbing for us. But my guess is that they're going to swallow this strategic gain and establish its normative probity, so to speak. And the only people who will really challenge that will be the Americans. And it's still very important that the Americans do undertake their freedom of navigation operations and their overflights. I wish we could do it with a few friends. Maybe with the Brits and the Singaporeans and the Japanese or something like that. Because it would be a very good principle to assert that we don't recognise the sovereignty. There is no basis for Chinese sovereignty at international law. The Permanent Court on Arbitration made that very clear in its decisions. But I don't think anybody's going to dislodge them. That's the truth.
I'm afraid we're going to have time for one more question. Richard here, just waiting from the aisle.
Thanks, panel. The question just continues the theme. The Prime Minister spoke at the UN about national sovereignty. We talked about Brexit, national sovereignty. The question is, when China does the Belt and Road Initiative, which is pan-national, and traditionally we would have relied on forces like security to come together and sort of combat that. We can't rely on economics because even state governments are getting involved in that initiative. How should we respond to that pan-national initiative under a world where greater national sovereignty should be the rule?
Look, this is a difficult one. I mean, you know, it's most worrying for us in our own region of the South-West Pacific, where those nations they're vulnerable, they're prone to being influenced by Chinese inducements, by, you know, cheap financing, big infrastructure projects, you know, political pork barrelling, those sorts of things. it's something that's hard to contest. I mean, we really need to contest it by sort of outbidding it in some respects, or providing these nations with an alternative. And we have been doing more of that, whether it's the undersea cable to kind of connect Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu to the internet, or it's helping them upgrade their shipping and port facilities. But we will need to be doing more, because it's really a bidding war. And, you know, China is using the Belt and Road Initiative for its own strategic ends. It doesn't mean, I mean, nations are free to accept it or reject it, of course. It's, but once China's got a foothold there, provides them another access or outlet to the sea, it often comes with quite you know, punitive or tough commercial terms, which might mean that nation then becomes indebted. This has happened in particular with a Chinese port project in Sri Lanka that's left the government there indebted and hence beholden in some senses. So, look, it's something we need to be wary of and pushing back against. I think there is a growing awareness in our own region that, you know, this gift horse is worth looking in the mouth, so to speak. And you're seeing, you know, change attitudes in countries like Malaysia under the new government, in Burma, or Myanmar, in Vietnam certainly has been like that. Even in the Philippines, I think their attitudes towards these things are changing, and that's healthy because I think they're realising that there are a lot of strings attached to these projects.
So if I could add, I'm delighted, I heartily endorse what Dave said, and delighted that he referenced Malaysia. They have a new young Prime Minister who is just 94, just 94. Now, I don't embarrass my wife, but every time she runs into John Howard, she says, you know, you are a young man. There is a big future for you in politics. And I see everyone in this room is young enough to commence a political career. And just take the Doc's example. But look, the Belt Road Initiative, I do want to say this. I think the Liberal governments, Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison, have handled the Belt Road Initiative very, very well. I think their policy has been extremely sound on this. So we don't sign up to it formally because it has strategic purposes apart from development purposes. On the other hand, we're not suggesting to anybody else that they should reject any particular project, because as Dave says, every country has a right to accept or reject any particular project, and any other country which wants to sign up to it has a right to do that if they want to as well. I think it is the height of folly and irresponsibility for the Victorian government to contradict the national government on a number of and sign up in principle to the Belt Road Initiative. And we have no need to sign up to it. The Chinese have been very keen to invest in Australia, in infrastructure, in mines, in real estate, and you know, in political fundraising. And our problem is not that we can't attract enough Chinese investment, you know. So we have absolutely no imperative to sign up to the Belt Road Initiative. However, in our key strategic area of concern, as Dave says, the South Pacific in particular, we simply have to match and better the Chinese. Now, you can't blame really poverty-stricken South Pacific nations like the Solomon Islands if the Chinese come to them with a bucket of money and say, okay, you know, we'd like to buy this island from you. It's as simple as that. Or we'll build your internet infrastructure. Now, we are working very hard not only to mobilise our own investment funds, but to mobilise the Japanese, who still invest more. The Japanese are bigger foreign investors than the Chinese. They're the biggest foreign investors in the world. We're mobilising Japanese, American, French, New Zealand money all the time. But when push comes to shove, we've just got to give stuff to the South Pacific, because it's very hard to outbid the Chinese commercially. Because they're acting for strategic purposes, they will offer you financing of a project on interest rates which no commercial provider can offer, because they don't mind if the project doesn't make a proper economic return. They're also quite happy to fund, you know, vanity projects which have no real economic benefit for the country that they're being funded in as well. But at the end of the day, when we are confronted with China building the internet infrastructure for Papua New Guinea and the Solomons, we'll simply say, all right, we'll say to the Papua New Guinea and Solomons government, we'll beat the Chinese off it, we'll give it to you. And that is a very sensible use of our aid effort. So I think, you know, it's against every instinct in my body to say this, but I think the government has done very well.
What a positive and uplifting note to finish on. I'm sorry it's happened again. We've ended the evening with a lot of hands still in the air, and I know there would have been many more good questions if we had time to continue, but alas, we do not. So please join with me in thanking Dave and Greg for their time this evening. We are in good hands with Dave in the Parliament, and I'm sure following the Malaysian example, Greg will be writing until at least 93, informing us all as a result through the pages of The Australian. Thank you all for coming this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. We will do more events like this in the new year. Please stay for one more drink if you can. Thank you.